On this week's NFV and SDN Reality Check, we speak with Metaswitch Networks on the importance of open source for telecom virtualization, as well as some of the top news stories for the past week.
Telecom Careers, the #1 global telecom and wireless job board, telecomcareers.com.
Thanks for joining us on this week's NFV, SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. Well, let's kick off the first show of the new year by looking at some of the top stories from the past week. AT&T this week updated its steady march towards a virtualization future, which will see the carrier hit software control of 70% of its network by 2020 using SDN and NFV technologies. And updating its progress, John Donovan, who's the Senior Executive Vice President for Technology and Operations at AT&T, said the telecom giant was on track to have 50% of its planned software built using open source software. Donovan said AT&T was asking vendors to focus their efforts on using and supporting OpenStack, as well as AT&T's plans to continue working with open source industry groups like OpenDaylight, OPNFV, ONOS, and the Linux Foundation. Donovan told attendees at this week's AT&T Developer Summit the carrier was also looking for a better balance between standards and open source in its approach to software. In addition, Donovan said the company's deployment of its AT&T integrated cloud nodes hit 74 nodes at the end of last year, which was ahead of its initial target of 69 nodes. This included international deployments, which Donovan said allow for better alignment with local regulations and improved security. In increasing its focus on cloud deployments, Donovan also asked developers to keep cloud in mind when they develop applications, which should ease integration down the line. Donovan also touched on AT&T's continuing big data focus, noting AT&T Labs recently created an open source big data virtualization tool that it dubbed NanoCubes, which is designed to provide a real-time map of millions or even billions of data points across the network. Also this week, BSS platform provider OpenNet said it plans to begin offering its VNF Lifecycle Manager software for free beginning in March. OpenNet said beginning March 31st, it will provide free access to the software for operators, system integrators, and VNF vendors. The company said the move is designed to hasten the adoption of vendor interchangeable interoperable virtual network functions and allow operators to more quickly benefit from advances in NFV technology. To further the move, OpenNet said it plans to release a community edition of its platform, which is currently an ETSI-compliant VNF manager for configuration management, monitoring, recovery, VNF orchestration, and lifecycle management in multi-domain and multi-vendor VNF environments. Well, that's it for the big news of the week. I recently had a chance to speak with Andy Randall from Metaswitch on how the company looks at the importance of open source as telecom operators move towards virtualization. Randall also touched on the challenges facing the software market as it looks to migrate virtualization platforms from the data center to the telecom space, as well as some new technologies like containers that are being used to simplify virtualization management. Let's take a look at the interview now. All right, well, today we are joined by Andy Randall, who's the GM of Networking Business Unit at Metaswitch, talking a bit about the NFV and SDN space and some open source and things like that. So, hey, Andy, definitely appreciate you taking the time today. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Dan. Great to talk to you today.
Very good. Well, maybe start off with, for those who don't know much about your company, obviously, I know a little bit, but not a lot. So maybe give us a little overview of Metaswitch and how you guys kind of operate and perform in the telecom space.
Yeah, sure. So Metaswitch, I guess the key thing that we're seeing is a transition of telco networks, of carrier networks from traditional kind of monolithic appliances into a more of a virtualized world. And that's something that we're driving across the business. And that's a transition that we're enabling to happen in a number of different areas. So where we're playing is primarily in kind of the real-time communication space. Mm-hmm. So we do residential communications, consumer communications, business applications, and then interconnect between networks. So those are probably the kind of the three main applications that are virtualizing that we're kind of being a big part of. So we have over 1,000 customers globally, from the likes of AT&T and Deutsche Telekom and Telstra, the big international tier ones, down to a lot of regional players. So that's kind of the most of the business is in that real-time communication space. Mm-hmm. And then the business area that I'm responsible for is actually more in the data networking side, so more the plumbing that's enabling this transition to virtualization. And we do that through a couple of routes. The first is we have core networking technologies that we supply to router and switch manufacturers across the industry. And then the other area is this open source project that I'm sure we're going to get more into in the conversation today, which we call Project Calico, which is all about the virtualization of that networking layer within the data center.
Very good. All right, that sounds good. Well, again, so I mean, it seems like your point of view, at least, is from almost from the data center side of it, like you said, which has a lot more history. It seems like when it comes to this move towards virtualization. So I'm guessing you have some pretty good insight into how the telecom industry is transitioning to, because it does seem like like you said, telecom is very traditional, the boring big boxes doing all this stuff, and now we're moving to this new exciting virtualized world. I guess from your point of view, how do you see that transition going from the data center type of technology, which virtualization is kind of coming from, to the telecom space? What I guess from your point of view how's that transition gone? And I guess what are some of the challenges you're seeing in that market? And how are you guys tackling some of those issues there?
Yeah, so I think the first point to say is that transition is still in its very early stages of infancy, right? So in terms of how has it gone, we're still just cutting our teeth.
Yes.
So I think what we're seeing is we're seeing the telcos look to large enterprises who were the early adopters and drivers of virtualization in the first instance, and looking at the technologies that were adopted there and realizing that there's a lot they can learn from, but also there's a lot about those use cases that don't apply in the telco world, right? So the nature of running an enterprise network, you have multiple tenants, maybe you've got different departments within the enterprise you're serving, but that's very different from a carrier that's serving millions of subscribers. Equally, most of what you're doing is compute bound, whereas in a carrier, it's all about pushing bits. So data plane performance becomes paramount. So something like our session border controller offering, which we've virtualized, getting that power to push through as many packets per second as to get as many sessions out of each unit of computing power as possible is really a key metric. And it's something that's very hard to do when you're starting from a hardware appliance and trying to virtualize it. So a lot of lessons around, what exactly it takes to get that hardware accelerated performance into a off the shelf standard kind of compute platform. So that's in general. I think the other things we're seeing around the actual orchestration layers, we're seeing obviously OpenStack has a huge mind share among the operators, which is really coalesced around this OPNFV initiative, Open Platform for NFV. But we're also starting to see carriers looking to some of the more innovative enterprises where they're adopting container-oriented orchestration systems. So, for example, Verizon recently announced they're working with Mesos, which is this orchestration environment for a whole variety of different workloads. But when they're starting to look at containers as opposed to virtual machine as the unit of work, then maybe they're starting to look at alternatives to OpenStack, probably running alongside for some time. But the data plane performance, what is the orchestration environment around that? Those are kind of the key issues that people are working on right now.
Yeah. Maybe not to get too much of a tangent here, but obviously that container part of it, because that is something that's kind of propped up fairly recently. I know, like you said, Verizon mentioned. I know some other carriers have mentioned some work in that field as well. I guess maybe can you explain a little bit about what that actually is and how that is changing? Kind of, I guess what was thought what was going to happen. Is that changing what people were thinking was going to happen? What's I guess the advantage perhaps of going that way, or maybe what's the bigger challenge of going that way?
Yeah, so I do think it's changing how people are thinking about the long-term direction of where things are going. So I guess the fundamental difference with containers is that instead of virtualizing an entire machine, you're just virtualizing those bits of the workload that need to be separated from others on that physical host. So you're not having to create a complete copy of the operating system for every workload that you stand up on a host. Now that means that you can do it a lot faster in a matter of milliseconds rather than tens of seconds, right? So and I think the thing that really got people's attention was when Google announced that they were running essentially their entire infrastructure on containers, and that they're firing up a container sometimes in real time in response to a specific web query coming in, right? So this idea that now when you've got that kind of speed, you can react in real time to workloads, work demands changing, fire up new containers, bring them down, move them from one server to another. It's a whole lot lighter weight, and it doesn't come with all the baggage of virtual machines. So that's kind of on the pro side. On the con side, what people are concerned about is, we've got a very well-established security model with virtual machines, very well-established deployment model. So there's, I wouldn't say it's, it's a done deal that all applications are going to be built in containers in the short term, but it's definitely, as people start to look at kind of how to build next generation applications, suddenly things that are built from the ground up for the cloud are going to be much more applicable to containers. And I'll give you an example here. So we have actually another project in open source within Metaswitch is what we call Project Clearwater. And this is essentially a platform for real-time communications. Kind of our standard packaging of this essentially looks like an IMS core. So some carriers are using that to essentially replace their IMS strategy. And because this was designed relatively recently, but always with the target of the cloud. Right? So in fact, the initial development environment for that was AWS. It was Amazon. Very different heritage from the typical IMS baggage that people have built up over the last 10, 15 years. That just drops in beautifully into a container environment. And we've had large carriers trialing this within containers, and seeing how it scales up. And so that's the kind of thing that you're going to see is the new applications built from the ground up are going to be able to leverage those architectures, maybe where you're doing more of a virtualizing of an existing legacy appliance platform. That's much easier just to convert that into a virtual machine. So that's why we're going to see this coexistence for some time, because the reality is there's so much technology out there that is going to have to transition into a virtualized world, that some of it is going to have to do this intermediate step via virtual machines. The new stuff is all going to be built on containers, on these lightweight orchestration systems like Mesos, like there's a Kubernetes project out of Google, all getting a lot of traction. And interestingly, a lot of that early traction is with the large enterprises rather than the carriers. So again, I kind of see, some of the large enterprises driving some of the early adoption, and the carriers will be looking to them for direction and translating that into a carrier world where it's not going to be a one-for-one translation. It's not going to be exactly the same as what the enterprises are doing. They'll adapt it. But it's a pretty exciting time actually to kind of see these technology choices all being made right now that are going to affect. I mean, we're talking about the next decade plus of evolution.
And it does seem like interesting too, because it is fairly new in the telecom space, or in the traditional, even wireless telecom space, to kind of this move towards virtualization anyway. It's such a new move for them, but to see these operators already looking to be fairly aggressive and perhaps even taking the next step. I mean, a lot of these guys aren't, have just really only started dabbling in the virtualized world. And already they're already looking ahead to hey, this is kind of cool. What can we do? What's the next step already? Should we start working on the next step already? Which, again, I've been covering telecom for a while now, and, they're a very conservative industry and they don't like to change. And, to kind of see all of a sudden these guys getting on board so rapidly and becoming fairly comfortable with it so quickly, it's interesting to watch how that's kind of played out. And it seems like, again, obviously the orchestration part of it's going to be key, because again, also legacy equipment out there has got to be supported, and you got to integrate these things together. So a lot that has to still be done to make this work. But it's interesting to see just the comfort level increasing already so much for the telecom operators out there.
No, I agree, and I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Really, it is about comfort level. It's about attitude and a sense of urgency, right? So I think AT&T has really led the way here. We were one of the first Domain 2.0 vendors. We've had some projects announced there. So we kind of see from the inside, but also you can see from what they talk externally about what they're doing.
Yeah.
They talk as much about education of their internal technology force as they do about, which technologies they're adopting, right? It's the retraining, the mindset adaptation that has to take place within a technology organization of hundreds of thousands of people is phenomenal. And I see it at the, some of the more leading edge conferences that we go to. There are representatives from carriers there that probably in the past would never have been at that kind of show. So I see the interest, and particularly, I'm based in San Francisco. I spend a lot of time down in Silicon Valley. Most of the big carriers have these offices in Silicon Valley where they're out scouting for the latest technologies, and they're all over it. So some of the early trials that we've done with Project Calico have been with carriers, with those kind of R&D labs, looking at how a container is going to come into the environment. Even though a lot of the real deployment that we've had is with OpenStack, where those engagements with carriers are happening, a lot of that is around thinking about what Kubernetes is going to do for them, what Docker is going to do for them, and how they kind of bring those technologies into the carrier world. So yeah, really fun time.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, yeah, like you said, you go to these shows nowadays, and it seems like the virtualized tracks or virtualized topics are becoming a bigger part of these conferences that have traditionally been, very kind of conservative, kind of telecom based. And now you've seen these whole tracks and different people and different languages and code words. And yeah, it's definitely interesting to kind of follow how that's all been coming along pretty well. But yeah, definitely interesting times for sure. That's for sure for the operators. But I guess again, maybe going towards the open source issue here. I mean, obviously, like you're saying, OpenStack has kind of at least taken a lot of mind share in terms of kind of this move towards support for SDN and NFV out there. How important is it to have that out there? And I guess what are the challenges you see that? Because I mean, it does seem like more recently there's been some concern that perhaps while OpenStack it seems pretty well supported, that there could be perhaps some limitations to it because maybe it's getting so big that it's almost becoming obviously there's standards involved with it, but whenever you start to standardize things, it tends to kind of slow down perhaps the continued development of those things. Are we getting to a point with like OpenStack, for instance, that it's becoming such a big resource that it can perhaps start slowing down the process, or do you think OpenStack is flexible enough going forward and with the open source community behind it that it can kind of keep pace with what needs to be out there for telecom operators?
Yeah, I mean, let's just take a step back, I guess, and think about why is open source attractive to carriers and relevant to the telco industry, right? So I think if you look back in the past, how standards got made, right, was you had the IETF or the ITU got together, and over a period of years, people would write down documents that said how they wanted things to work, and then eventually that would get signed off, and the vendors would go away and implement it. Everyone would implement to the same specification. In theory, it should interoperate. It never did. So there'd be a period of, a year, 2 years, 3 years where we were plugging things together and making sure that they interoperated and kind of getting to that point. And eventually you'd have some degree of minimal interoperation between the vendors, and every vendor was trying to differentiate. Mm-hmm. What open source does is it reverses that process. It turns that process on its head by saying, let's start with the implementation, mm-hmm. and then we're guaranteed that we have a standard that is going to work for everyone. So it's not about, I think some vendors misunderstand this, some carriers misunderstand it as well. It's not about let's get some stuff for free. It's really about let's create a way of building a consensus around where we want to go that's faster than what we've done before and allows us to iterate faster. Mm-hmm. And getting code out there and having people review it and fix it up and contribute to it is by far the fastest way of getting to a consensus view of what the solution should look like. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially what's been driving this. OpenStack, I think it's been a great example of how a community builds around a really solid good core value proposition for a project, right? So there was a great project put out there, which a lot of people came onto. I think there've been issues with some of the governance. I think when you think about any multiple vendor kind of initiative, then governance becomes a major question. You submit some change upstream, and it can take a long time to get approved, or it just takes one guy who doesn't like you to say, no, I veto that, and it doesn't happen, right? So and we've had some of this with Project Calico, with our project. We've been working for over the last 3-4 releases to get things that we needed upstream, which were relatively minor in the big scheme of things, and it did take that time to get that approval from the community and to make people feel like, yeah, we were part of that community where they accepted those kind of contributions. But I don't think that's a bad thing. There's something to be said around community consensus. I think if I look at OpenDaylight, that's a different kind of model in terms of the governance around that and how it was set up. So whereas with OpenStack, you had an initial seed project that had been pretty much built out by a couple of companies working together. With OpenDaylight, you had a big consortium from day one, right? And everyone getting together and trying to build something. And so you've got everyone's vision of what it should be. And you end up with something that kind of becomes, has to fulfill everyone's requirements that kind of put resources into that project to begin with. And it becomes a very multi-dimensional, multifaceted bit of technology, and much less focused than something like a Mesos or a Kubernetes, where you have very many fewer players to begin with. And I was actually talking with another player in the industry who announced a fairly high-profile open source project recently, and they were saying, right now we have to pursue a benevolent dictator kind of model here. We want to control the direction. At some point, we will put it into a foundation and we'll make that governance more open. But if it's going to be successful to begin with, you can't have too many hands, stirring the pot in different directions from day one. You've got to create an identity, create a useful thing, give it a certain direction, and then start to bring in the community as well. So, and we've seen that with Project Calico. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I guess Chico seem directly involved in that, because it does seem like that's kind of the challenge is, you get all these organizations that have popped up, OPNFV, OpenDaylight, various things out of Linux Foundation, that are kind of all, driving different slices of the big pie here. But yeah, they have kind of approached different models to this. And then you have kind of the more vendor-driven ones that have popped up as well. A bunch of vendors have done different ones that they've also had too. And from the outside looking in, it seems like it's just chaos going on. Because for a while there, it seemed like every week there was a new organization or a new foundation or something popping up. And, you think, how is this all going to, at the end of the day, all come together, and how's everybody going to be talking the same language, and how's it all work, for an operator who, is kind of looking at the bigger picture of things. I guess as you approach it, as Metaswitch approaches it, what's your view on making sure that, obviously you do want to make sure that what you're working on does have some, that it does make sense. There's not just chaos going on. So you do want to kind of drive it to an extent, but at some point you do have to kind of open it up and bring other people on board. I guess, what's the process involved in that, and trying to, again, not lose people initially because you want to make sure you have enough support, but, kind of drive it, and then opening it up. It's got to be kind of a nerve-wracking situation to kind of be part of that and having that all work with the system. How's that all play out for you guys?
Yeah. So I think excuse me. I think the way I think about that is, as we build Calico into being, a much bigger project and having a much greater impact across the industry, it's something that'll naturally happen. It'll become a part of the natural evolution. Given that at the outset, we have the right kind of intentions and motives behind it. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So if I contrast that with, there are some projects out there, and I'm not going to name them, the people who work with them know what they are, right? So where a vendor takes a product and they throw some code over into open source, and they say, hey, we're open, right? And then they continue to develop their proprietary product behind the paywall, right? And the open source project really is it's a marketing gimmick. And, I've had customers come talking to me saying, I want to go work with this open project. But the vendor that's behind it tells me, a serious company is never going to work with the open source project. You need the enterprise edition, right? Because that's the one that's got all the bug fixes in it, right? And that's a very common approach. And if you do that, what you're doing is you're orphaning the open source project. You're not really putting everything you can behind the open source project. And I think customers are getting savvy to this kind of approach as well. And they're asking the right kind of questions as well. So yes, we will have commercial applications that are built on top of and around Calico, but it's not going to be an entirely separate branch of code, right? We're going to have the core product, and that'll be the open source repo that's out there on GitHub is what we're going to be using. And there'll be some ancillary things you can do, management, visualization, security monitoring, things that'll plug into it, that don't detract from the value and the quality of that core product. We have to make that viable at scale, and all the bug fixes go into that open source product. So that's kind of the base statement about the open source project. And then once you've made that statement, then you'll start to get people involved in it and contributing. And at some point, people start to question, well, if we're contributing, what's the governance around this? How do we make sure that things get accepted, that we need to be accepted? But by then, if you've built up sufficient momentum, you can say, okay, we've now got enough of a community around this that we feel comfortable that we can create a foundation around it and, put it into one of the existing foundations, whatever, put that kind of governance structure in place. But I think people want to see a strong leadership to begin with and a vision behind the project, but tied with a, very much an open view of what you're trying to do.
Sure. And that seems like that's kind of the way that open source can break out of this proprietary model. If you get enough momentum behind it, it does seem like you said, the carriers are getting behind it. Obviously, with the domain program, AT&T, when they first started that, they brought on a lot of new companies to the telecom space who didn't have a lot of history, but had these great ideas that were open source based. They had some bigger guys as well, but it was interesting to see their comfort level, bring that up again, but their comfort with these new players to come in and say, hey, you guys are doing something interesting there. We want you to be on board with this and kind of drive us along. So it does seem like the telecom operators, at least, are, like you said, are on board with that, at least having an open source as part of this, because, again, the traditional telecom vendors out there, we know who they are, the big guys, like you said, a lot of them do talk about open source. A lot of them are doing a lot of open source stuff, but there's always, it's a big change for them because it's a whole new business model for those guys. They're having to do something different. So it does seem, I guess that's kind of key for open source, is to make sure you get enough support behind this that you can take on those big proprietary systems. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what wins out, hopefully, at the end of the day for this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things is it becomes this virtuous circle as well, where if one of the consequences of us doing Calico in a very open way has been that the other open source vendors find it a whole lot easier to work with us, right? So we work very closely with Metaswitch on the development of Mesos. We work closely with Google and CoreOS on where Kubernetes is going, and and of course with OpenStack as well. And it's so much easier when everything's an open source to do that integration. You make a bit of changes on your side, we make a bit of changes on our side. It's all out in the open. There's a new release goes out, 2 weeks later, and bam, it's out there, it's done, right? Compare that to the kind of traditional partnering kind of interfaces that you have to do, where it's all behind closed doors and it's all secret source. It just accelerates that ecosystem innovation as well. And I think that's what the customers see.
Yeah, it seems like too we're still in that time frame again, like you were saying earlier. We're in it's a very early stages of this for the telecom world. And it seems like we're still at the part where it's all of the guys who are developing the code and the technology who are working together, and they always seem like they want this to work. They don't look at, for better, good or worse, they don't look at the financial model down the road. That's not really their biggest concern. They just want to see if this stuff actually works and get it to work. They're not worried about the lawyers coming in later with the IPR and all that kind of stuff. They just want stuff to happen. It seems like we're still in that phase where this is somewhat new, and so people are very much on board to try different things. And It's very discovery. It's very, people are just trying things out and just, hey, this is good. Let's try this and not worry about, what happens a year from now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, people are still working out what are the viable business models here. Yeah. The customers are still working out how do they work with us. I had dinner with someone fairly senior in procurement department at a tier 1 telco a few months back, and she said to me, our engineering departments are coming to us with these open source companies that they want to work with.
Yeah.
And I don't have a process for how I procure from them. Right? It's like all my standard, license documents, etc., don't apply in this world. So, I don't think, and they've moved along and they're moving fast with that, but it's, that seems like a very trivial thing. I mean, and it is compared to actually building a viable long-term open source business, but it's all those little, every step in the way of the traditional way that customers work with vendors changes, and that both sides have to change their processes and expectations along with that as well. So.
Yeah. These aren't like significant hurdles, but they are hurdles that have to be, at some point they've got to be surmounted, and you got to figure out the way to do it. But yeah, it does seem like people are still working very aggressively. I know, I've talked to all the telecom operators, and the people they have dedicated to their virtualized platforms and their virtualized work, they are, it seems like, very quick thinking, fast working people. They want this to move forward rapidly. I mean, they've got the other departments, the operations side, who are still running the networks, but they get the people now who are really trying to push the next evolution of it. So yeah, it does seem like there's a lot of quick work being done to get this stuff handled as fast as possible. And open source obviously seems like one of the ways that's happening as well, because again, everybody kind of has access to everything, and it just makes it much easier to at least see what's happening behind the scenes.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, big part of that. Well, I guess, we've been talking way too long here, but obviously a lot going on in the open source world. I definitely appreciate, Andy, the great insight on this. I mean, again, like you're saying, we are very early in the process here. I know I've been covering this for a couple of years now, at least the virtualization side of things, and a lot's happened over the past couple of years, but it seems like we're almost hitting that point now where it's like things are really coming together, and it's, the next year or two are really going to show a lot of that work that's already happened, really show it on a commercial side of things. We're going to start seeing operators start to deploy things, and virtualization really kind of start to come out to the networks there. So I'm guessing for you guys, it's a very exciting time. Obviously, a lot of work going on, but I'm sure for you guys are seeing a lot of exciting work right now.
Yeah, we are, absolutely, and it's across the industry. One of the things with Calico, we are working a lot with enterprises as well. So seeing we've got a real lens into what's happening across the industry, and I think the trend towards virtualization is inexorable. The trend towards open source is inexorable. Yeah. There is a new model of how business is done, how technology is developed that is taking over the world.
Yeah. Obviously, it's been good to kind of follow it all, and hopefully, again, we can touch base again soon. I'm sure if we talk 6 months from now or 12 months from now, I'm sure a lot of these things that we've talked about now will all be in the past, and it'll be all these new challenges going ahead. And it's always very exciting to kind of follow that along. So, but hey, Andy, we definitely appreciate the great insight on this today. Thanks so much for the time on that, and hopefully, like I said, we can talk again soon on the topic.
Yeah, let's do that. It was good talking with you, Dan.
Well, that'll do it for this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. Thanks for watching, and make sure to check us out again next week.
NFV SDN Reality Check with Dan Meyer is a production of RCR TV. To suggest show topics or to reach Dan, you can find him on email, dmeyer@rcrwireless.com, and on Twitter @Meyer_Dan. For more Dan, news on NFV SDN and everything wireless, find your way over to rcrwireless.com.